Hello, it's been a couple of months since we did our last IVD focus frequently asked Friday question. So today we're focusing on the summary of safety and performance. So the question that was posed to us is as follows. We're beginning work on a procedure for the summary of safety and performance. Since the regulatory text for the IVDR in Article 29 and the MDR in Article 32 is very similar, we think expectations for the SSP and the SSCP, which is the summary of safety and clinical performance in the MDR, will be similar. Does QServe have any suggestions on using MDR guidance for the IVDR? The MDC guidance for the SSP says it's relevant to if it's relevant to patients, a separate section should be included for this information. For IVD test kits, is this only relevant for self-tests? And finally, the SSCP guidance also includes a version history section. Is it likely notified bodies will expect a version history for the SSP? Okay, so let's start with point one. Using MDCG guidance, which is written for the MDR for the IVDR. I think the first thing I'd say is yes, you should be tracking this. Some of the guidance that's already been published is actually relevant for both. And a couple of examples here is there's a guidance on clinical evaluation for the MDR, but it also references the performance evaluation for the IVDR, and that's focused on software, so it's relevant to both. There is also a guidance on the PRRC, and again, that's written both for medical devices and IVDs. So it's important to keep a watch out on this. I know the IVDs is slightly further behind than the medical device, but they're already publishing text which is equivalent to both. Now, there is also some medical device text that's worth looking at, even though they don't actually immediately seem obvious to apply to the IVD. And the one that I'd pull out here is if you actually look at the guidance for clinical evidence for legacy medical devices, it actually cross-references a MedDev document, which is 2.7.1 Rev 4. And in that, there is an annex which talks about how to do a literature search. So formal literature searches is something that really, in the IVD side, we've not really had to do before, certainly under the IVD. So therefore, this is well worth having a look at. It's the only place that there is some guidance on how to do a formal literature search. You're going to need to do that for your scientific validity. You're also going to need to do it as part of post-market surveillance. So it's well worth tracking these particular documents, and I've just done a screen grab here of where you will actually find that information on the Commission website. So this is just a bit of a scene setter just to remind ourselves where the SSP fits in the overall scheme of things. So we're creating our performance evaluation data. We've got our plan, which we then summarize the output of that into our report. Then we've got to keep that up to date. And so to do that, we'll be doing our post-market surveillance. And also we have our post-market performance follow-up, our PMPF. And out of that, particularly for the D and C devices, we'll be creating a periodic summary of safety and performance, our PSUR. And out of that, the public facing part of that is our summary of safety and performance, our SSP. And again, that needs to be updated for C and D devices, and that you need to be looking at that on an annual basis. Very much your PSUR and your SSP are linked, particularly if you look at the way that they're actually reviewed by the notified body. So when is a patient-specific section actually required for the IVDR? Well, bearing in mind that the SSP is publicly available, it needs to be written in a way that, and to use the words in the text, says, for the intended user and if relevant to the patient. So when is it relevant? If you have a professional test, then it's kind of reasonable to assume that that's who you're writing this for. and that, as the manufacturer suggested in the question, it's a reasonable assumption to make that actually the patient, where relevant, is primarily for self-test devices. So that's a reasonable working assumption for now until there is actually formal guidance. My only note of caution here, though, is that one of the functions of the IVDR is to improve transparency. And so therefore it might be considered that it is important to actually have a patient section. Maybe perhaps an equivalent to consider is an orthopedic surgeon is actually going to implant a hip replacement. However, we've got patients these days who are interested to learn about the implant that they're having, and therefore there would be information that would be relevant to the patient. That's more part of transparency. However, we haven't got guidance at the moment. It's a reasonable assumption to make that the patient part is more directed at the self-test, and to continue on that basis until further guidance comes out. But it is possible it could change in the future. So part of the assumption of this particular question was that the SSP is similar to the SSCP. So I just thought, let's actually have a look at this. So this particular slide really shows you how they are similar and different. So they are very, very similar. However, there are obviously things which are particular to the medical device, and in particular here we've got point D, which is possible diagnostic or therapeutic alternatives, which is something particularly if you were looking at alternative treatments that might be available, definitely very specific to the medical device side. And we don't have that if we look across into the text for the IVDR. In a similar way, metrology and traceability of values is not applicable to medical devices as it is to IVDs. So under point F, we have our own additional piece. And then obviously there is the clinical evidence and the performance evaluation for IVDRs. So there are differences there. But generally, if you actually look at the rest of the text, they're pretty similar. So if we now kind of move on and we look more specifically at the MDCG Guidance document, because the first 4 points that it addresses in the guidance are actually word for word identically written in the MDR and the IVDR, it's pretty good to assume that the guidance will be similar between the MDR and the IVDR. And so the text I've taken here is actually from a template that is at the end of that guidance document. So these are very consistent, and definitely you should be looking at them. Now, the other sections are where we start to deviate a little bit. So obviously we've got PMCF for the medical device, and we have our PMPF. And I've kind of taken the key bullet points that again come from that template and just kind of looked at it with maybe an IVD sort of set of glasses on. And actually, it's still pretty comparable between the two if you were replacing performance as opposed to clinical. But we shouldn't forget that within our clinical evidence, we've got scientific validity, analytical performance, and we also have clinical performance still as well. So we shouldn't forget that. So clinical performance is still relevant on the IVD side. And then obviously we've got the difference, which is the metrology piece, which we shouldn't forget on the IVD side, which would be our add-on, our additional piece. So yes, I would basically say then it's well worth looking at the guidance documents. Bear in mind it's not written for the IVD, so there will be differences, variation on a theme. Very good place to start. So the final part of the question was about the revision history. So again, if we go to the template, that is in the MDCG document, it actually has a revision history page on the end. This is slightly confusing because you have to read the full text of the guidance document, because the notified body is the person who actually uploads this to the UDAMED database. And the notified body, if it's a high-risk device, so if it's a Class 3 medical device or a Class D IVD, is going to be reviewing each of those. And therefore they will be reviewing as part of this the SSP, and they will be then uploading it to the database. Now, on the other hand, if it's a Class C device, there is an element of sampling here. So it's possible if you had a whole range of devices and maybe the notified body has just looked at the first two, but you have maybe another 4 devices within that same family, they haven't actually reviewed all of those before they upload them. So therefore, they have to make it clear which ones they've reviewed. Now, another fact as well is that you also need to have your SSP translated into the languages in those countries where you're going to be selling it. In the same way that you'd be translating the IFU, you also need to be translating the SSP. But the notified body is only going to review one language. So they also have to indicate when they upload which language version they've also reviewed as well. So there does need to be a revision history because this information needs to be recorded. However, it isn't necessarily yourselves as manufacturers who are going to be completing that information. It would be the notified body. So certainly there needs to be space for a revision history. However, whether this is something that ends up being hard-baked into the UDAMED database, or whether it is a text which the notified body specifically wants to have put in a particular way, and they will then complete an update, is probably a conversation to have with your notified body. But yes, if you're putting templates together for now, I would use what is actually in that MDCG guidance document as a good place to start. And again, as we get more use of the medical device regulation and the IVD regulation, these practices will become more consistent, and obviously ultimately we'll get IVD regulation guidance, which will give us much more specifics on this. But for now, it's good that you're starting to write those documents on how to write your SSPs, but it would be a good thing, I would say, to put in your templates. So I think that completes all the 3 parts of the question. Thank you very much for your questions. Please keep on sending those in. We do like to receive them. We are also working on a frequently asked question document, which we'll be publishing on our webpage as well in the future. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope you found this useful.